The morning started like any other on the cowboy's quiet ranch, but something in the air felt different. The sun had not fully risen, and the world was still wrapped in a gray-blue light. Usually, the only sounds at this hour were the gentle wind brushing through the dry grass and the soft snorts from the horses in the stable. But today, something else was there, something unusual. A low, shaky sound kept slipping through the silence, almost like a hum, almost like a whisper. At first, he thought he was imagining it. Maybe it was the wind pushing through the boards. But when the sound grew slightly louder, he paused in his tracks. He stood on his porch, one boot half fastened, waiting to hear the sound again. It came in a faint wave, not sharp, not threatening, just strange. He looked around the empty land stretching far on all sides. Nothing moved. The fields were calm. The morning felt calm. Yet that noise still floated through the air. He took a slow breath and headed toward the stable. The cold earth crunched softly beneath his boots. His ranch had been his home for years, a place where every corner felt familiar, where every noise had a meaning he understood. But this he could not place. He tried to think what animal it could be. Maybe a wounded coyote had wandered inside during the night. Or maybe a stray cow from the neighbor's land had slipped through a broken fence. But even those didn't feel right. The hum didn't sound like anything from around here. When he reached the stable door, the horses inside were unusually restless. He could hear them shifting in their stalls, hooves tapping anxiously against the wooden floor. They weren't making loud noises, but their breathing was quick. They sensed something too. He rested one hand on the stable door and gently pushed it open. A thin line of light broke through the darkness inside. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Normally, the familiar smell of hay, mixed with the soft sounds of horses, settling into a new day greeted him. But today, the air inside felt heavy, warm in an odd way, as if something had been moving around all night. The first thing he noticed was the hay on the floor. It was scattered everywhere, not in the usual messy way horses kick it around. This looked different, more like something had dragged across it. Patches of hay had been pressed down in smooth, curved shapes, as if something long had rested there. He walked further in, each step slow and careful. His eyes adjusted to the dim light. Near the back of the stable, the warm patches on the ground caught his attention. He crouched down to touch one. It felt slightly warm, not hot, but warm enough to make him pull his hand back in surprise. Whatever had been there had not left long ago. He rose to his feet and followed a faint trail. It wasn't a dirt trail, but more like a soft glow on the old wooden boards. He blinked, unsure if he was even seeing it clearly. The light was very faint, like someone had dragged a glowing object along the floor and left only the weakest trace. His heart thumped against his chest, not from fear, but from deep, confusing curiosity. Nothing on earth left glowing marks, not animals, not tools, not anything he kept in here. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. It was still there. He followed the little glowing streaks toward the darkest corner of the stable. His boots made slow, steady sounds on the floor. The horses kept shifting behind him, nervous but quiet. He kept one hand against a wooden beam as he walked deeper into the shadows. The trail led to a narrow space between two stacks of hay bales dot as he stepped closer. He could feel something unusual in the air, like the soft warmth that comes from a living creature trying to stay still and unnoticed. His breath grew lighter, slower, and he leaned forward just enough to look behind the haystack. For a moment, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. There, curled up tightly in the corner, was a small creature unlike anything he had ever seen in his life. It wasn't a wild animal, not from this land, not from this world. Its skin shimmered with a faint metallic glow, shifting colors softly the way the sky changes during sunrise. Its eyes were half open, tired, and full of fear. It looked weak, trembling slightly as if it had been cold or hurt. He froze, completely still. The creature didn't move either. They simply stared at each other, both shocked in different ways. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He knew enough about animals to understand that sudden movements could scare them. Then, from behind the first creature, two larger shapes slowly lifted their heads. They were almost the same, but their eyes were stronger, more alert. They looked like they were ready to defend the small one if needed. But even they didn't growl, or hiss, or make any threatening sound. Instead, they looked exhausted, worn out, like they hadn't slept in weeks. The cowboy's heart raced, but he kept his expression calm. These beings, whatever they were frightened, not dangerous. He could feel it. Their eyes didn't carry anger. They carried fear and sadness. He took one slow step back, giving them space. The largest creature made a low humming noise, almost like a warning, but not sharp enough to be taken as aggression. More like a parent trying to protect its child, while also being too tired to do more. He gently raised his hands, palms open, a universal sign of peace taught by nature itself. He whispered softly, not words meant to be understood, but a tone meant to reassure. The creatures blinked slowly, following his every move. He stayed like that for several long seconds. The stable felt completely silent, except for the quiet breathing of both the creatures and the horses. The cowboy could see the smallest creature trembling. Something was wrong with it, maybe hurt, maybe sick. Its body wasn't glowing as brightly as the others. After a while, he quietly stepped backward toward the entrance. He didn't want to scare them more by staying too close. He didn't run or panic. He simply left them where they were, giving them the space they seemed to need. Outside, he leaned against the stable door, letting out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He kept replaying the image of the creatures in his mind. He had no idea what they were, but they weren't ordinary. They weren't harmful. They weren't from around here, and they were frightened. He stood there for several minutes before stepping back inside the stable again, but this time only halfway. He didn't go anywhere near the corner. He simply checked the horses, gently brushing their manes to calm them down. He talked to them softly, the way he always did. The creatures in the corner remained silent. There was no sign they were moving. Maybe they were waiting to see if he would attack. Maybe they were too tired to move at all. The cowboy decided not to approach them again that morning. He left the stable quietly and returned to the porch. His mind raced with questions. Should he tell someone? Should he call for help? Should he pretend he didn't see them? The ranch was miles away from any town. Very few people visited him. He liked his quiet life. He wasn't someone who jumped to call authorities. And deep down, something told him these creatures didn't come to hurt anyone. They were hiding. They were scared. And they had ended up in his stable because they had nowhere else to go. He spent the rest of the day thinking about them. He kept checking the stable from the outside, but never entered again. He didn't want to disturb them. As the sun moved across the sky, he noticed the horses calming down again. That meant the creatures weren't moving around anymore. By evening, he made a small decision. A quiet one. A simple one. He placed a bucket of water near the stable door, not too close to frighten them, but close enough that they might find it if they needed it. He also left a small pile of hay and a few pieces of old fruit he had stored in the kitchen. He didn't know what these creatures ate. He didn't even know if they ate at all. But he couldn't bring himself to do nothing. That night, as the sky turned dark and the stars grew brighter, he sat on his porch with a lantern dimly glowing beside him. He kept thinking about the small trembling creature in the corner, the way its eyes seemed to plead for safety. He didn't understand their story yet, But he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a deep sense of responsibility. He looked toward the stable, barely able to see its outline in the dark. Whatever those creatures were, they were on his land now, and they clearly needed help. The night air was quiet again, but he didn't forget the strange sound he had heard that morning. Something had brought them here. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he stepped into that stable earlier, everything in his life quietly began to change. The next morning, the cowboy woke up earlier than usual. Even before the sun peeked over the horizon, his mind was already on the creatures he had seen the day before. Sleep had come in fits, and each time he closed his eyes, he imagined the small trembling one hiding in the corner of the stable. Its eyes, half shut and full of fear, haunted him. He didn't know what they were, or where they had come from, but he knew one thing clearly: they needed help. After a quick breakfast, he grabbed his worn coat and quietly made his way toward the stable. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy smell of damp soil and hay. As he approached, he could see faint glimmers of light spilling from inside the stable. They weren't bright enough to illuminate the room, but they were enough to remind him that whatever he had seen yesterday had not left. His heart thumped with both excitement and caution. He paused at the door and took a deep breath, preparing himself for what he might see. He opened the stable door slowly, making the least noise possible. The horses were calm, as if they had gotten used to the strange presence overnight. The air felt warm and slightly different, not unpleasant, but unusual, like something living had breathed there for hours. The cowboy stepped in quietly and moved toward the back corner, keeping his eyes on the glimmers of light he had noticed. This time, the small creature wasn't alone. Two larger ones were sitting beside it, their heads low and tails wrapped carefully around the smaller one, as if protecting it. The shimmering scales of all three reflected the soft morning light filtering through the stable cracks. Their eyes followed him cautiously, not with aggression, but with wariness. They seemed to study him the way an animal studies a stranger, who has entered its space but does not intend harm. The cowboy froze for a moment. He didn't want to make any sudden moves, but he wanted to get a closer look. The smallest one, trembling slightly, peeked out from behind the larger ones. It blinked slowly, and in that brief moment, he felt a connection, a silent understanding that neither spoke aloud, yet both knew the other was not there to cause harm. He remembered the food he had left the night before. Slowly, he reached for it, making sure not to look threatening. With careful movements, he placed the hay and fruit a few feet away from the creatures. Then he stepped back. The creatures watched him for a moment, unsure what to do. After a long pause, the smallest one crept forward, its movements delicate and cautious. It sniffed the food and nibbled a tiny piece, then quickly retreated behind the protective larger ones. The cowboy smiled softly, feeling a mix of relief and curiosity. They were learning to trust him, even in the smallest ways. The larger ones shifted slightly, but remained calm, watching every movement with careful eyes. He realized that they were not just animals hiding. They were a family, a unit that depended on each other completely. The way they moved together, the way the smallest one followed the larger one's lead, it was like nothing he had ever seen before. As the morning passed, he stayed near the stable, observing quietly. He didn't try to touch them or force interaction. Instead, he spoke softly to them, letting his voice carry calm and reassurance. The sound of his words seemed to reach them in ways he could not understand. The smallest one began to inch closer to the food, encouraged by his calm presence. The two larger ones stayed close, still watchful, but slowly relaxing. Hours went by, and he noticed something remarkable. The creatures were intelligent, not in a human way, but in the way they understood situations and responded thoughtfully. The smallest one seemed to recognize him as safe. It would peek out, check that he wasn't moving too fast, and then approach again. The larger ones, while protective, also observed his patterns, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he didn't threaten them. They were learning, adapting, and responding in kind. By mid-morning, he decided it was time to give them some water. He filled a small trough with clean water and placed it near the food. Again, he stepped back to give them space. The smallest one approached the water slowly, lapping at it carefully. The larger one stood close, but did not block it, letting it drink first. The cowboy realized how much trust this took. They were allowing him to stay in their space while they ate and drank. In the animal world, trust like this is earned slowly, and he felt honored that they were beginning to let him in. As the sun climbed higher, he noticed something else. The smallest creature had a faint mark on its side, almost like a scrape. It was small but visible enough to tell him that the creature had been injured, likely during whatever had brought them here. He felt a wave of compassion and worry. They had traveled far, somehow survived, and now were hiding in his stable, injured and alone in a world that could easily harm them if they were discovered. He knew he had to do more than just leave food and water. He needed to find a way to help them heal, but he also had to be careful. If anyone discovered them, they could be taken away or harmed. The cowboy thought about how isolated his ranch was, and he realized this was an opportunity to help them safely, in secret. He could build a place in the stable, a hidden corner where they could rest and recover. It would take patience and care, but he was willing to do it. He spent the rest of the morning quietly cleaning a small area in the corner, moving hay bales to create a barrier, and piling fresh straw for them to rest on. The creatures watched him cautiously from a distance, not understanding everything he was doing, but recognizing the calm intention behind it. He made sure not to make sudden movements, not to speak too loudly, and not to invade their space. Every action was slow, deliberate, and careful. By afternoon, the small creature began to venture closer to the area he had prepared. The larger ones followed, keeping close to the smallest one, but their stance was relaxed now, not defensive. The cowboy placed more food and water nearby, watching as they explored the new space. They sniffed it, nudged the straw, and seemed to approve in their own way. He felt a sense of quiet triumph. They were beginning to see him as a friend, not a threat. As the day drew to a close, he decided to sit quietly in the stable, letting them get used to his presence. He didn't make any noise, just watched as they settled in the hay. The smallest one lay down first, curling up between the larger ones. Their bodies glowed faintly in the dim light, shifting colors softly like tiny waves of warmth and life. He watched them, feeling a strange mixture of wonder, responsibility, and awe. He thought about the events that might have brought them here. The glowing light he had seen yesterday, the faint hum, the warm patches on the floor, it all suggested something extraordinary. But he didn't know how or why. What mattered was that they were here now, and they needed him. He made a silent promise to protect them, to give them food, water, warmth, and safety. That night, as he left the stable and closed the door quietly behind him, he felt a new sense of purpose. The creatures were still there, safe for now, and he would continue to care for them. He knew it would take time for them to fully trust him, and he was willing to be patient. They were not just strange beings in his stable. They were a family, frightened, and alone, and he had the chance to help them survive. He lit a lantern and sat on the porch, looking out at the stars. The night was quiet, but he could still feel the faint presence of the creatures inside the stable. They were safe for now, and he knew tomorrow would be another day of careful observation, quiet gestures, and patient effort. Every moment with them would teach him something new about their world, their needs, and their intelligence. He thought about how different this life had become overnight. Just yesterday, he had been alone, working the ranch, tending to horses, and living a quiet, predictable life. Now he had something extraordinary to protect, something beyond his understanding, yet deeply connected to his care. He knew it was just the beginning, and that their story together would be full of surprises, challenges, and remarkable discoveries. As sleep approached, he felt a sense of calm. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he was ready. The creatures in his stable had found a place of safety, and he had found a purpose that went beyond the ordinary. He closed his eyes, imagining the small trembling creature resting between its protective family members. And for the first time in days, he smiled. He knew that this was the start of something extraordinary, something that would change his life forever. And as he drifted into sleep, he promised himself that he would do everything he could to help them, to earn their trust, and to give them a chance to live peacefully, even in a world that might not understand them. The morning light crept slowly across the ranch, and the cowboy woke with a sense of quiet anticipation. The past 2 days had been unusual, filled with moments of wonder and careful observation, and today he felt ready to take the next step. He dressed quickly, putting on his worn boots and jacket, and grabbed a small bag with water, some fresh fruit, and a few vegetables. He wanted to offer more food, but he also wanted to do it without startling the creatures in any way. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of dew and earth. As he approached the stable, he noticed the soft hum he had heard the first day. It was faint, almost like a melody carried in the wind. His heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but curiosity. Whatever made that sound was here again, and he hoped to see it more clearly today. He opened the stable door slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The horses stirred slightly, but remained calm. He moved inside quietly and made his way to the back corner where the creatures had been hiding. As he approached, he could see them more clearly in the early light. The smallest one peeked out from behind the 2 larger ones. Their shimmering scales reflected the faint sun filtering through the stable windows, creating tiny glimmers of color that danced across the hay. For a moment, neither he nor the creatures moved. They simply studied each other, both careful, both curious. Then he placed the food he had brought near them, stepping back to give them space. The smallest one inched forward, its legs trembling slightly, but moving with determination. It sniffed at the food, tasted a piece of fruit, and retreated behind the larger ones for safety. The cowboy watched, fascinated by their behavior. The way they moved, the way they protected each other, showed a level of care and intelligence he had never seen in any animal on his ranch. He spent the morning observing them quietly, speaking softly so they could hear the tone of his voice. He didn't try to touch them yet. He knew that trust would take time. The smallest one began to explore more, moving between the 2 larger ones with caution, but growing more confident with every step. He noticed subtle movements in the larger ones, the way they would shift slightly, watching every move he made, but never making a sudden motion. They were protective, but they were also beginning to relax. By late morning, he decided it was time to provide water. He filled a small trough with clean water and placed it near the food. The smallest one approached first, hesitating slightly before drinking. The larger one stood close, allowing it to drink, their movements calm and deliberate. Watching them, the cowboy felt a deep sense of connection forming. It was as if, in their own quiet way, they were learning to trust him, and he was learning to understand them. He noticed more about them with each passing hour. Their eyes were intelligent, full of awareness, and their movements were purposeful. The smallest one occasionally glanced at him, and though it did not speak, its gaze seemed to ask questions he could not answer, yet wanted to understand. The larger ones responded with protective gestures, nudging the smallest one gently and guiding it away from anything that seemed uncertain or unsafe. The cowboy realized that these creatures were not just animals. They were a family. And like any family, their bond was strong. The smallest one depended on the larger ones for protection, and the larger ones watched over the smallest with patience and care. He felt honored that they were slowly allowing him into their world. Even if only from a distance. As the day went on, he decided to do something he had not yet tried. He began creating a safe space for them in the stable. He moved old hay bales carefully, building a barrier that would give them privacy. He piled fresh straw for them to rest on and made sure the area was comfortable, warm, and secure. The creatures watched his every move, curious but cautious. They did not approach too closely, but they did not retreat either. They seemed to understand that he was trying to help, even if they did not fully trust him yet. He placed some food and water in the new space and stepped back. The smallest one ventured in first, sniffing around, testing the new area. The larger ones followed, their movements slow and deliberate. He watched as they explored, noting how careful they were with each other. The smallest one nestled between the larger ones, curling up in the straw, and for a moment, everything was quiet. The cowboy felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They were safe, at least for now, and they were beginning to accept the space he had created for them. During the afternoon, he stayed nearby, sitting quietly in a corner of the stable. He did not try to interact directly, only observing, allowing the creatures to adjust at their own pace. The smallest one occasionally looked at him, and he responded with soft words, calm gestures, and slow movements. He realized that communication did not always require speech. Trust and understanding could be built through patience, consistency, and care. He also began to notice subtle signs of their intelligence. The creatures seemed to recognize patterns. When he approached with food, they became curious. When he stayed quiet, they relaxed. They learned quickly that he posed no threat and that he was there to help. The cowboy marveled at their ability to adapt, to observe, and to respond thoughtfully. It was as if he was witnessing a language of gestures, glances, and movements that only they fully understood. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, he realized he had spent the entire day in the stable. He had been cautious, patient, and attentive, and the results were clear. The creatures were beginning to trust him, and he was beginning to understand them. He knew the journey was far from over, but this first day of closer interaction had been a success. The smallest one eventually fell asleep, nestled between the two larger ones. Their bodies glowed faintly, the light shifting in soft waves, creating a calm, peaceful atmosphere. The cowboy sat nearby, watching them sleep. He felt a profound sense of connection, as if he had become a small part of their world, and they a part of his. It was a silent understanding, a bond forming without words, built on trust, patience, and care. Night fell, and he left the stable quietly, closing the door behind him. Outside, the world was calm, the stars bright in the clear sky. He felt a mixture of exhaustion and contentment. The creatures were safe, and he had begun to earn their trust. He knew that each day would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and new opportunities to deepen their bond. As he sat on the porch, he reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few days. What had begun as curiosity had turned into responsibility. The creatures were no longer strangers. They were a family he had promised to protect. The thought of their journey, their fear, and their resilience filled him with both awe and determination. He knew that he had a role to play in their story, a role that required patience, care, and unwavering commitment. He thought about the future, imagining the days ahead filled with careful observation, quiet gestures, and gentle interactions. He understood that trust would not come all at once. It would be built slowly, day by day, moment by moment. And he was willing to give them the time they needed, to show them through actions, not words, that he could be trusted. As sleep approached, he felt a deep sense of peace. The creatures were safe, comfortable, and beginning to feel at home in the stable he had prepared for them. He closed his eyes, imagining the smallest one resting between the protective larger ones, their faint glow casting soft light across the hay. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax, knowing that he had taken an important step in helping them. He promised himself that he would continue this careful, patient approach. He would learn from them as much as they learned from him. And above all, he would do everything in his power to ensure that they felt safe, protected, and cared for. This was the beginning of a bond that would change everything for the creatures, for him, and for the quiet ranch where the extraordinary had found a home. As the night deepened and the stars shone brighter, the cowboy finally drifted into sleep, a gentle smile on his face. He had learned that trust could be earned, that patience could heal fear, and that even in the most unexpected circumstances, connection was possible. The creatures in his stable were no longer just strangers, they were a family. And he was their guardian. And in that quiet, peaceful moment, he understood something important. Life had a way of bringing the extraordinary into the ordinary, if one had the patience and heart to notice. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of dew and fresh earth, as the cowboy walked toward the stable. The past few days had changed him in ways he could hardly explain. Life on the ranch had always been quiet, predictable, and routine, but now it had taken a turn toward something extraordinary. He had learned to move carefully, to observe quietly, and to respect the presence of the creatures he had discovered. Today, though, he felt a strange mix of curiosity and caution. He sensed that there was more to their story, something he did not yet understand. As he approached the stable, he noticed the faint shimmer of light that had become familiar over the past days. The small creature was already awake, nestled between the two larger ones, its scales glimmering softly in the morning light. They looked at him as he entered, not with fear, but with curiosity. He smiled gently, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He had learned that patience was key. The creatures responded to the tone of his voice and the calmness of his presence more than anything else. He stepped carefully to the back corner, bringing with him a few pieces of fresh fruit and some water. He placed them near the creatures, stepping back to give them space. The smallest one approached first, sniffing the food before taking small bites, while the larger ones observed closely, ensuring their little one was safe. The cowboy watched them, noticing small details he had never seen before, the way the smallest one communicated through tiny movements, the way the larger ones nudged each other gently, and the way they seemed to understand each other, perfectly without words. As he observed them, he began to notice patterns. The creatures were intelligent, far more intelligent than any animal he had ever cared for on the ranch. They watched him closely, learning from his actions, and seemed to understand the routines he followed. He realized that their behavior wasn't random. It was thoughtful, deliberate, and purposeful. They were trying to make sense of him, just as he was trying to understand them. Curiosity overcame him. He wondered where they had come from, and why they were here. The faint glow of their scales, the strange humming sound he had first heard, it all suggested something beyond this world. He had seen lights in the sky weeks before, unusual and fleeting, that no one in the nearby towns could explain. Could these creatures be connected to those lights? His mind raced with possibilities, yet he kept his thoughts quiet, not wanting to disturb the fragile trust that had begun to form. He began to notice more unusual details. The smallest one had a faint scar along its side, and the larger ones had marks that suggested a long journey or struggle. They were not just hiding, they had been through something difficult, perhaps even dangerous. He realized that they were survivors, and he felt a surge of empathy. They had arrived in his stable exhausted, scared, and alone, and now it was his responsibility to keep them safe. The cowboy spent the morning carefully arranging a small, protected area in the corner of the stable. He moved hay bales to create a private space, laid fresh straw for comfort, and ensured the area was free from drafts. The creatures observed every move, their eyes alert, but calm. They didn't approach too closely, but they didn't retreat either. They seemed to recognize that he was creating a safe space for them, and though they couldn't speak, their reactions showed understanding. As the sun climbed higher, he began to notice something extraordinary. The creatures communicated in ways he had not understood before. It wasn't through words, but through gestures, glances, and subtle pulses of light from their scales. The smallest one emitted soft flashes, and the larger ones responded in turn. At first, he couldn't make sense of it, but slowly he began to see patterns. They were sharing information, conveying emotions, and perhaps even memories in a language that was entirely their own. Intrigued, he sat quietly in the stable, watching and listening. The creatures seemed to sense his calm attention and began to relax. The smallest one moved closer to him, curious but cautious. The larger ones remained nearby, protective but not aggressive. It was as if they were inviting him into a small part of their world, allowing him to witness their behavior and their interactions without fear. Then, something remarkable happened. The smallest one nudged a loose piece of wood, which revealed a faint, glowing pattern beneath it. The light pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat. The cowboy leaned closer, fascinated. It was unlike anything he had seen before. The larger ones watched his reaction carefully, and he realized they were aware of what he had discovered. It was as if they wanted him to understand something important. Over the next few hours, he observed them more closely. The glowing patterns seemed to communicate in response to his presence, changing in intensity and rhythm. He began to sense that these creatures were showing him parts of their story memories, emotions, and perhaps even their journey to his stable. It was a slow process, but the connection was growing. He realized that their presence on his ranch was not random. Something had brought them here, something beyond his understanding. Perhaps they had been searching for safety, or perhaps they had been separated from their home in ways he could not yet comprehend. The thought filled him with both awe and responsibility. They had survived something extraordinary, and now they were in his care. By afternoon, he had decided that observation alone was not enough. He needed to help them recover fully. The smallest one's injury, though minor, needed attention. The larger ones were protective, but he could see that care was required. He gathered some soft cloths, clean water, and a few herbs he knew were safe from his ranch. Moving slowly, he approached the creatures, speaking in a calm, gentle tone. At first, they were cautious. The smallest one froze. The larger ones tensed slightly, but they did not flee. They watched his movements carefully, as if measuring his intentions. He began gently cleaning the smallest one's injury, using soft motions and careful attention. The creature trembled slightly, but allowed him to work, and the larger ones remained nearby, alert but calm. As he worked, he noticed a faint glow from the smallest one's scales near the injury. The glow pulsed gently, as if responding to his touch. He realized that these creatures had a way of communicating, and perhaps even healing, that was entirely unique. It was a subtle, almost magical process, but it was real, and he felt honored to witness it. By evening, the creatures seemed more relaxed than ever. The smallest one nestled between the larger ones, and they all appeared comfortable in the space he had prepared. The cowboy stepped back and watched them, feeling a deep sense of connection. He had begun to understand them, not fully, but enough to know that trust, care, and patience were key. That night, as he sat on the porch, he thought about everything he had learned. These creatures were intelligent, resourceful, and deeply aware of their surroundings. They had survived an incredible journey, and now they had found a place of safety. He realized that his role was not just to provide food and shelter, but to understand, protect, and nurture them in every way possible. The stars shone brightly overhead, and he felt a sense of wonder and humility. Life on the ranch had changed in ways he could never have imagined. The creatures in his stable were no longer strangers. They were a family, survivors who had entrusted him with their safety. And he knew, deep in his heart, that he would do everything in his power to honor that trust. As sleep approached, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would continue to observe, to learn, and to care. He would protect them from harm, provide them with the food, water, and shelter they needed, and slowly, carefully, earn their full trust. And one day, perhaps, he would understand the full story of where they came from, and why they had ended up in his stable. But for now, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that the creatures were safe, comfortable, and beginning to feel at home. The bond between them had grown stronger, built on patience, understanding, and quiet acts of care. And as he drifted into sleep, he knew that the extraordinary journey was only beginning for them and for him. The next morning, the ranch was quiet, except for the gentle rustle of wind through the grass and the soft, low sounds from the stable. The cowboy woke early, his thoughts already on the creatures he had been caring for. Over the past few days, he had begun to understand them better, their habits, their needs, and even small glimpses of their intelligence. But today felt different. There was a weight in the air, a sense of urgency that he could not explain. As he approached the stable, he noticed the creatures were unusually alert. The smallest one, usually timid and hesitant, was standing near the edge of the straw, its tiny body trembling slightly. The larger ones were close, protective, their eyes focused on him as he entered. He froze for a moment, sensing that they were trying to communicate something important. There was a silent urgency in the way they moved and glowed, a message he did not yet fully understand, but could feel in his chest. He carefully placed the food and water near them, stepping back to give them space. The smallest one approached cautiously, but then something unexpected happened. It lifted its head and let out a soft, low sound, unlike anything he had heard before. It was almost like a plea, gentle and urgent at the same time. The larger ones responded, their glowing scales pulsing rhythmically, and the cowboy realized they were all trying to convey a message together. He stayed still, watching and listening. Slowly, the meaning became clear. They were asking for his help, not just for comfort or food, but for life itself. Their movements, their glows, their gentle sounds, it was a silent plea to survive, to be safe, to have a chance to continue living in peace. The smallest one moved closer to him, trembling but unafraid now, and he felt the depth of their trust. For the first time, the cowboy understood that this was no ordinary responsibility. He was not just feeding or protecting them. He was their guardian, their lifeline, the one who could give them a chance to live in a world that might not understand them. The weight of that realization pressed on him, but instead of fear, he felt determination. He would not let them down. He knelt slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements calm. The smallest one stepped closer, sniffing his hand, and then nudged him gently. The larger ones mirrored the action, their heads moving in unison, as if acknowledging his promise to protect them. The cowboy's heart swelled with emotion. These creatures, so different from anything he had known, were showing him that trust could be deep and profound, even without words. The day passed with careful observation and gentle interactions. He spent hours sitting near them, speaking softly, offering food and water, and simply being present. He noticed subtle signs of their emotions, the way the smallest one would lean against the larger ones when nervous, the way the larger ones would emit soft glows when the smallest one was unsure, and the way they all seemed to respond to his calm presence. It was a dance of trust, a quiet understanding forming between human and creatures. By afternoon, he decided to make the stable even safer for them. He moved additional hay bales to create a small shelter within the corner, a private space where they could retreat if they felt threatened. He piled fresh straw for warmth and comfort, and ensured there were no drafts or gaps that could make them uncomfortable. The creatures watched his actions carefully, but they did not resist. They seemed to understand that every movement he made was for their benefit. As he worked, he noticed the smallest one observing him intently. It moved closer, watching each step, each adjustment he made. At one point, it nudged a piece of hay toward him, and he realized it was trying to help in its own small way. The larger ones responded with gentle pulses of light, almost as if they were communicating approval. The cowboy smiled softly, realizing that their bond had grown stronger than ever. They were no longer merely surviving in his stable. They were learning to live, and he was learning to understand them. Evening approached, and the creatures began to settle in their newly arranged space. The smallest one curled up between the two larger ones, and their bodies glowed softly in the fading light. The cowboy sat nearby, watching them, feeling a profound sense of connection. He understood, more than ever, that they were asking for more than food or shelter. They were asking for life, for safety, for trust, and for a place where they could exist without fear. He realized that his role had evolved. He was no longer an observer. He was a protector, a guardian, and a friend. Their lives depended on his care, his patience, and his willingness to understand them. The weight of that responsibility was immense, but it was also a gift. He had the chance to make a difference in the lives of these extraordinary creatures, and he was determined to do so. As night fell, the cowboy lit a small lantern and remained near the stable, keeping watch. The stars shone brightly overhead, and the world was quiet except for the soft, rhythmic sounds of the creatures breathing and the faint pulses of light from their scales. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that they were safe and beginning to trust him fully. The smallest one shifted slightly, moving closer to the edge of the straw, and the cowboy noticed a subtle change in its glow. It was brighter, warmer, almost like a heartbeat of hope. He reached out slowly, allowing it to sniff his hand again, and it nudged him gently. The larger ones responded, their pulses of light synchronizing with the smallest one, creating a quiet, glowing rhythm. In that moment, the cowboy felt the depth of their plight to live, to be safe, to have a chance at life, and he knew that he would do everything in his power to honor that trust. He spoke softly, not words they could understand, but tones of reassurance and calm. The smallest one responded by leaning slightly toward him, and the larger ones relaxed their stance. It was a silent agreement, a mutual understanding that he would protect them, and they would allow him into their world. The cowboy's heart swelled with emotion. These creatures, so different from anything he had known, had entrusted him with their lives, and he accepted that responsibility without hesitation. The night deepened, and he continued to sit near them, observing their movements, their subtle glows, and the small gestures that conveyed their emotions. He realized that every action, every moment of care, strengthened the bond between them. Trust had been earned, not given, and he felt honored to be a part of their lives. As he prepared to leave for a short rest, he made one final promise to himself. He would continue to protect them, to care for them, and to provide a safe place where they could live without fear. He would be patient, understanding, and attentive to their needs, no matter how small. And above all, he would honor the silent plea they had made, the plea to live. He stepped outside, closing the stable door gently behind him. The night air was cool and calm, carrying the faint scent of hay and earth. The creatures were safe, warm, and beginning to trust him completely. He felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that their lives were intertwined with his own in a way that was extraordinary, unexpected, and profoundly moving. As he sat on the porch, gazing at the stars, he reflected on the events of the past days. From the moment he had first heard the strange hum in the stable to now, he had learned lessons about patience, trust, and the power of compassion. These creatures had survived incredible challenges, and now, in his care, They had a chance to continue living, growing, and thriving. Sleep finally approached, and he allowed himself to rest, knowing that he had done everything he could for the day. The creatures were safe, comfortable, and beginning to feel at home. The bond between them had grown stronger, built on patience, understanding, and quiet acts of care. He understood that this was only the beginning, and that their journey together would continue to unfold, filled with challenges, discoveries, and moments of profound connection. And in that quiet, peaceful moment, he knew something important. Life had brought the extraordinary into his world, and he had the chance to protect it, nurture it, and honor it. Their plea to live had been heard, and he had answered with his heart. The morning sun rose slowly over the wide fields of the ranch, casting a warm golden light across the stable. The cowboy woke with a sense of purpose. Over the past several days, he had witnessed extraordinary things, learned to understand the creatures, and begun to feel a deep connection with them. Today, he sensed, would be different. Today, they seemed ready for a step closer a day, where trust would deepen and bonds would solidify. He approached the stable quietly, carrying fresh food, water, and a soft blanket he had prepared for the smallest one. As he entered, the creatures greeted him with cautious curiosity. The smallest one stepped forward first, its glowing scales pulsing gently as if saying, "We trust you." The larger ones followed, moving slowly, protective yet relaxed. The cowboy knelt on the straw, careful not to appear threatening. He laid the blanket down and set the food nearby, stepping back to give them space. The smallest one approached the blanket, sniffing it carefully. The cowboy watched as it circled once, then curled up on it, visibly relaxing. The larger ones settled nearby, their glowing scales shifting in soft waves of color. He realized that this was more than just comfort. They were beginning to feel at home. They were no longer hiding or trembling. They were learning that this place, and he, could be trusted completely. He spent the morning observing their behavior, noticing subtle changes that told him how far they had come. The smallest one was playful now, nudging the blanket and occasionally trying to touch the cowboy's hand with gentle curiosity. The larger ones responded with soft pulses of light, almost like laughter, acknowledging the smallest one's explorations. He smiled quietly, amazed by their intelligence, their communication, and the way they had begun to understand him in return. By midday, he decided to introduce a new element to their space. He had found a small wooden crate that he cleaned and padded with straw. He placed it in the corner of the stable, showing the creatures from a distance what it was. At first, the smallest one hesitated, eyes wide and glowing faintly. The larger ones nudged it gently, encouraging it to explore. Slowly, it stepped inside, testing the crate, then backed out. After a few careful attempts, it finally curled up inside, clearly satisfied. The cowboy realized they were beginning to interact with their environment in ways that were safe and confident. As the afternoon passed, he began to notice more subtle signs of their emotions. The smallest one would occasionally glance at him, then nuzzle the larger ones for reassurance. The larger ones, in turn, would emit pulses of light in response, creating a rhythm that seemed like a conversation. The cowboy watched in awe, realizing that their world was rich with communication, emotion, and understanding. They were not just surviving, they were thriving, learning, and growing. He decided to spend the rest of the day helping them become even more comfortable. He brought fresh hay, placed water in multiple locations, and added small toys for the smallest one. The creatures were curious but cautious, testing everything slowly. Each time the cowboy approached, he spoke softly, offering calm tones that reassured them. Gradually, they began to move closer to him, allowing him to sit near them as they explored. The cowboy noticed that the smallest one had become bold enough to mimic some of his movements. If he reached out a hand slowly, it would nudge his fingers gently with its snout. If he shifted on the straw, it would adjust its position to stay near him. The larger ones responded too, their pulses of light following the movements of both the smallest one and the cowboy. It was as if a family had learned to trust an outsider and invited him into their circle. Evening arrived, and the light outside faded to a soft orange. The creatures seemed to sense the change, settling down for the night. The cowboy prepared a small corner for himself nearby, keeping a watchful eye. He felt a deep sense of peace. They were safe, comfortable, and beginning to feel at home. More than that, he felt they had accepted him as part of their family. As he sat quietly, the smallest one approached, nudging his hand with soft curiosity. He allowed it to touch his palm gently, feeling the warmth and softness of its glowing scales. The larger ones leaned in slightly, forming a protective circle around the smallest one and the cowboy. He realized in that moment that he was no longer a mere observer. He was part of their world, and they were part of his. Night fell, and the ranch was quiet, except for the soft breathing and occasional pulses of glow from the creatures. The cowboy lay down nearby, keeping watch, but he no longer felt tension or fear. The creatures were at peace, and he felt a profound connection to them. They had survived a long journey, found safety in his stable, and now, together, they were creating a life built on trust and care. Over the next few hours, he reflected on how much life had changed. Before, he had lived a simple life on the ranch, caring for horses and maintaining the land. Now, he had a family unlike any other, creatures that were intelligent, emotional, and entirely dependent on his care. The responsibility was immense, but the reward was greater. He had been given a chance to protect life in a way that went beyond ordinary understanding. As the stars twinkled above, he realized something important. Life had brought the extraordinary to him, not through force or luck, but through a quiet, patient process of discovery, trust, and care. These creatures were not just extraordinary because of their appearance. They were extraordinary because of the bond they shared, the emotions they expressed, and the trust they placed in him. The smallest one stirred, curling closer to the cowboy's side. The larger ones shifted slightly, forming a protective barrier around both. The glowing pulses of their scales seemed to synchronize, creating a gentle, rhythmic light that filled the stable with warmth. The cowboy reached out slowly, placing a hand on the smallest one's back. It leaned into him, accepting his touch fully. The larger ones watched, and allowed him to remain close. In that moment, all fear and uncertainty melted away. He had become a true guardian of this family. As sleep approached, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that the creatures were safe, comfortable, and trusting him completely. He thought about the journey they had all shared, from the first day he had discovered them, trembling and hiding in the stable, to now, when they glowed softly, relaxed, and secure. The trust had been earned, the bond strengthened, and the family had begun to thrive in their new home. The cowboy realized that his life would never be the same. The creatures had changed him, teaching him lessons about patience, trust, compassion, and the quiet power of care. They had shown him that even the most extraordinary beings could find safety and love in unexpected places, and that connection could form without words, without explanations, but simply through presence, understanding, and respect. He drifted to sleep with a sense of gratitude, knowing that tomorrow would bring more discovery, more moments of trust, and more chances to strengthen the bond he shared with this incredible family. They had survived against the odds, and now, together, they would continue to grow, explore, and live. In the morning, the ranch would once again be filled with soft glows, curious movements, and gentle sounds of life. The cowboy knew that every day with them would be a lesson, an adventure, and an opportunity to protect and nurture life that was truly extraordinary. And he welcomed it with his whole heart, This was no longer just a stable on a quiet ranch. It was a home, a sanctuary, a place where trust had been built, where fear had been replaced with connection, and where the cowboy and the alien dragon family could live together in safety, warmth, and understanding. The journey had started with curiosity, continued with patience, and now had reached a point of profound connection. The creatures, once abandoned and frightened, had found a protector. The cowboy, once alone in his routine life, had found a family. And together, they would face whatever came next side by side, united in trust, care, and the quiet joy of simply being together. And as the stars shone above the ranch, the stable glowed softly from within, a small beacon of life, trust, and hope. The extraordinary had arrived in the ordinary, and in that quiet, simple place, a new story had begun, a story of survival, love, and the unbreakable bond between a human and a family unlike any other.